Thank you so much. My job is to introduce our fearless leader, Dr. Rebecca Blank. Dr. Rebecca Blank became Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison in July 2013, a little short of 3 years. And she earned an undergraduate degree from the University of Minnesota and a doctoral degree from MIT, both in economics. Prior to joining UW, Dr. Blank served as a Deputy Secretary and Acting Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in addition to her strong public service leadership, she brings equally strong academic credentials to the position of Chancellor. She served as Dean of the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. She was a member of the faculty at Northwestern University and Princeton University. And since she joined us, UW, we have faced many challenges, such as like budget cuts and tenure issues, which brought lots of unwanted media attentions, unfortunately. But despite all of these difficult times, we all had faith and confidence in her that not only will she get us through these ups and downs, but in the end, she'll make us be a much stronger university. Well, Chancellor Blank is truly an inspiration for all of us on campus. And I can tell you that Chancellor Blank has been a truly role model for me personally, and also a champion for 4W initiative. So about a year and a half ago, when Lori and I visited with the Chancellor, introducing the concept, proposing the idea that we like to do this, and as always she does, she listens and she asks very difficult questions. Think about this, think about that, what are you doing about this? And after giving us a great feedback, and she said, how can I help? And we didn't hesitate to ask for help. And we said, we are envisioning this inaugural 4W Summit a year and a half later. We'd like you to help us identify a very visible global national leader who embodies what 4W stands for, but also who can be a major draw. And she was kind of listening and thinking, I know who I'm going to talk to, and Donna, Shalala. So she made it happen. Please welcome Dr. Chancellor, our Becky Blank.
Thank you, Soyan, for that very kind introduction. I am delighted to be here. I've been out of town the last 2 days, so I've missed the first 2 days of this conference, which I'm very sorry about because I've heard just great things about the conversations and the presentations, and you can all tell me more after this all happens today. But I do want to welcome all of you. Thank you for coming. Special thanks to those people in the audience who've traveled a little further in order to be here today. Whenever you get an interdisciplinary crowd together, much less an international crowd, you always know that very good things are going to happen. So I hope this is just the beginning of an international conversation about how to integrate our on-campus research with the programs and outreach around the globe in ways that can change lives. And it's hard to imagine a better place to talk about 4W and this type of work than here at the University of Wisconsin. We've been a pioneer in the transfer of discoveries and innovations here on campus out into the state and beyond that to the nation and the world. In fact, we care about this enough that we have our own name for it. We call it the Wisconsin Idea, as you all know. It's, there you go. It is hard to imagine a more appropriate keynote speaker for the summit today than Donna Shalala. Donna has spent much of her career advocating for the involvement of university researchers and the value of research in solving some of the world's most difficult problems. In the 5-6 years that she spent as chancellor here at UW, she was a strong, strong supporter of the commitment of this university to the Wisconsin Idea. She challenged our researchers to commit to share their knowledge and discoveries, not only to improve the diagnosis and treatment of diseases, to build better computers, or to help farmers grow better crops. In fact, 30 years ago, she made a speech in which she urged public universities around the country to embrace the bold notion that social science researchers ought to be advising policymakers on the best and most effective strategies to address difficult problems. And that's a message we still need to be carrying, I fear. But Donna's legacy goes far beyond just her work for advocating for the Wisconsin idea. As the first woman to lead a Big Ten school, and only the second woman in the nation to lead a major public research institution, the first was Hannah Holborn Gray over at the University of Chicago, Donna brought to this campus a level of energy and a level of leadership and a perspective that really helped the entire university focus and redefine our priorities, from academics to athletics, you know the transformation she made there, to fundraising to diversity. Donna left Wisconsin for Washington, D.C., where she served as Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Clinton, before returning to higher ed for a very long stint as the president of the University of Miami, where she really transformed that university and brought it up the rankings in a number of amazing ways. In all of her roles, including her current position as head of the Clinton Foundation, Donna Shalala has brought energy and leadership, a deep understanding of the value of bipartisan work, and a strong commitment for advocating for this nation's top universities. She holds more than 50 honorary degrees and many other honors, including the Medal of Freedom, awarded by President George W. Bush. So we are very fortunate to have her leadership on this campus, and I hope that we carry forward her legacy as we continue her work on issues that can change the world, issues like the well-being of women across the globe. I am delighted that Donna was willing to come back to address this summit, and I welcome her back to campus. So please join me in greeting Chancellor, Secretary, and President Donna Shalala.
Becky. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Becky. Becky and I have been friends for a very long time. She broke my arm to come out here, actually. You only let friends do that for you. I was very impressed, though, in the material I read about 4W, because making life better for women and making the world better for all is obviously something all of us are committed to. It really extends the Wisconsin idea to the boundaries of the world, and of course there are no boundaries for the world. And this is an extraordinary university, and like everyone else, I worry about it. I tell the story, and I told the story when I was here. I went off to Japan, probably the Trilateral Commission, some unnamed thing, and we went to visit the foreign minister, and he had a beautiful Japanese garden. And I went out to the garden, and I said, listen, I'd love to have a garden like this. Could I take your gardener back to Wisconsin? The foreign minister says something very important to me. He said it would take my gardener and 100 years to have a garden like this. That is the story of our great research universities. But they're also very fragile, and we forget they're fragile, because they're so big and ornery, and but we forget about the fragility of the great research universities in this country. So all of us have to always renew our commitment to these extraordinary institutions, particularly the public ones that we worry so much about now. I want to thank the Dean and Lori for also for being my hosts this weekend. I want to thank my old friend Paula Barner, who owns this building. I met Paula when she was assistant athletic director, if I remember correctly, and I convinced her, I personally convinced her when Gail Langer wanted to recruit her over here that she needed to expand her career and come over to the Alumni Association. She's done a wonderful job as leader of the Alumni Association. And this is a lesson for the students in the audience. You never know where relationships will lead you. When I skipped out of Wisconsin to go down to Washington, the Clinton folks were very nervous because the first thing the Republicans said was she was the high priestess of political correctness. I always thought that was a great line. So Clinton's staff said to me, hey, do you know any Republicans? And I said, yeah, I came out of Wisconsin. I know a lot of Republicans. So Mel, the great Mel Laird,
and Tommy Thompson and Bob Kasten simply said to me, "Don't worry." And they really went to bat for me. There's just no question about it. They talked to every Republican. And in fact, I was confirmed with, I think there was only one vote against me. It was Bob Smith from New Hampshire, who was really further to the right than Mel or Bob Kasten or Tommy ever thought of. And he didn't vote for me, but he also lost his seat the next time around. But we were sort of lining up votes, and I'm watching the confirmation hearings with President Clinton, and suddenly Strom Thurmond gets up and makes this very nice speech about me. And Clinton turns to me and said, "Do you know Strom Thurmond?" I said, "Never met the guy." It turned out that Paula's parents lived and were friends of Strom Thurmond's. So they wrote a little speech for Strom to get up on the floor, and he voted for me. He was very proud of the fact that he voted for me. He took advantage of that, of course, and asked me for all sorts of favors, but he was very proud. But it tells you something about, you just never know about these connections and how these connections will play out in the future. And I'm very proud of the way I was able to work with Republicans here in the States and Democrats. The Democrats were just as conservative when I was here. Nothing like today. Becky has to deal with a whole different ideology than I had to. I remember Snarlin Marlin. Oh, my God. He did not like UW. He got up on the floor of the legislature and gave a speech about the quiche-eating, white wine-drinking, intellectual elites at UW. Within 2 hours, we delivered to his office a quiche and a bottle of white wine. And, by the way, endeared himself to us. And more importantly, we notified all the Republicans. So he was a Democrat. They were in hysterics about how fast we had responded to Snarlin Marlin. But he turned out to be a good friend. So you never know about these kinds of things as you're working your way through leadership assignments. When I arrived in Wisconsin, my second year, I think it was, I spoke at the memorial service for Professor Ruth Bleier. And for those of you that didn't know Ruth, and I know Judy Levitt and Susan Friedman, who had introduced me to Ruth, she was a distinguished neurophysiology professor, and she devoted herself to looking at the scientific theories and the practice in a feminist way. And she really disproved the myth that differences between men and women in math and language and in creative skills were biologically based. She was a very distinguished scientist and had a huge impact on really our understanding of the role of women and men, let alone her impact on feminist studies and on the feminists and the people that cared about the future of women on this campus. She also was a great advocate for equal pay for women faculty. There were other very distinguished scholars here at that time who have since passed on. Nellie McKay, the great scholar of African American literature, who was a very good friend. Gerda Lerner, she had some questions about me, but she came around a little bit. But Gerda Lerner was a tough character, but a great historian. Ada Deer was around at the time, who was the first woman Indian woman, Native American, to head the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And of course Liz Carland, who was an abortion provider and a very close friend of all of ours, and really relentless in her commitment to women's health. And there was a young woman that I got to know briefly here and then got to know years later, Lauren Clark. And if you didn't know Lauren Clark was an astronaut. She did her undergraduate work here, I think in zoology, if I remember what she told me, and got her MD here. She was an astronaut who was killed in the Columbia disaster. And I met her years earlier during the Clinton administration when Hillary and I went to see one of the flights at NASA. We went to Florida to see one of the flights, and she was my escort, and she was very excited. First of all, she found red somewhere. But when I signed in, I'll never forget, I had just shaken hands with her. I didn't know she was from Wisconsin. And she wrote I just signed my name, and she wrote next to it, "Go Badgers." But she was a perfect example of the extraordinary women that came out of Wisconsin. Born and raised in Wisconsin, she was fearless. There's no question about it. Very proud of her Wisconsin roots. And a very sad day during that Columbia disaster for those of us in Wisconsin. The first conference on the status of women at the university was actually in '64, and it was a long time ago. But women caring about the lives of women, the point I wanted to make is that it was a great Wisconsin tradition, and different. And I really had an extraordinary time here with the leaders of women and gender studies, with the feminists, and with the males that were feminists. I remember when John Wiley and David Ward came to work for me, I said, "You guys are feminists, aren't you?" I said, "I can't have people working for me that..." They said, "Oh, yeah, we're in." We're in. I was hoping that Becky would introduce me without mentioning athletics, because every place I go on this earth, someone walks up to me from Wisconsin and says, "Thank you for bringing Barry Alvarez to the University of Wisconsin." The legend is that you can walk into any bar in Wisconsin, any place in Wisconsin, and mention my name, and they'll buy you a drink. But, we joke a little about athletics, but that was the glass ceiling for women in higher education. It was that and fundraising. Those two things was what stopped women from getting major jobs in higher education. You notice that Hannah Gray was the first woman, but she didn't have a football team. They were part of the Big Ten academic conference, but she didn't have a football team. So I was the first one that got the job that had a football team. And I tell the story about when I was interviewed for the job, because my old friend, really old friend, Catherine Lyle, was the deputy at the system. She had been my deputy assistant secretary and chief economist at HUD in the Carter administration. I didn't know Buzz Shaw as well, but when I was called to see whether I was interested in Wisconsin, I was at Hunter at the time, I called Catherine. She said, "Donna, don't even bother. They're not going to hire a woman at Wisconsin. Not a chance in the world." And then they called me for the interview, and Catherine assured me they were just putting me on the list because they had to do affirmative action, and they were just putting me on the list. And then Buzz called me. He said, "I don't know." He said, he said, "It's a tough search committee, but, you really, why don't you go interview anyhow? But there's not a chance that they're going to pick a woman." So I get to the interview, and it was in Chicago. Of course, everybody was avoiding the rules that you had to have all these public processes. There wasn't a press person to be seen at the Chicago airport, at the hotel, the Hyatt at the Chicago airport. So I went in for the interview. It was a very nice interview, but they didn't ask me anything about athletics. And, and here I knew that athletics was it. They did ask me about fundraising. They didn't ask me about anything about athletics. So near the end of the interview, I said, "You've got a big athletic program." And they all sat up. And I said, "So what do you want from your athletic program?" And they said, "We just want to be competitive." And I stopped for a minute. I looked at them, and I said, "Then I'm really not your candidate. I live in New York. I only know how to put together strategies to be number one." Apparently, the other two candidates were total nerds. They were guys, but they were total nerds and weren't at all interested in athletics. So I got the job, and the rest is history. But I have to admit, I didn't know anything about Division I athletics. In fact, even though I had gone to Syracuse to graduate school and my major professor made us go to football games, we went to as few as we could in the cold weather, because at that time Syracuse played outside. I didn't know anything about Division I athletics, and though my mother had been I was a tennis player myself. So on my way out to take the job, I read the college issue of Sports Illustrated, the football college issue of Sports Illustrated. I mean, that was my introduction. But how did I realize suddenly that it was really important? Because the day I fired Don Morton, they interrupted the soap operas and ran the press conference live. Now, I tell all of this because that was the glass ceiling for women. If you look at what's happened since then, there are a lot of women that have raised a lot of money, including one of the presidential candidates, but there are a lot of women that have raised a lot of money at the major universities, and there is no serious glass ceiling. Most of the Ivy Leagues have had women. The Big Ten has had a number of women now. The Pac-10, I mean Pac-12, I guess it is now. At any rate, the major universities, in fact, when Alabama played Ohio State for the national championship, both places were headed by women. When Miami played Ohio State, both institutions were headed by women. So that the glass ceiling has clearly been broken. And I can't say that I really broke it. I was lucky because of who, and you're always lucky because of who are the other candidates in the pool. But I've always been amused by my experience at Wisconsin, but it's also taught me a lot of lessons about listening, about making friends, about that women have to often make an extra effort. And universities are tough places to administer, whether you're a woman or a man. And right now, they're even tougher than they've ever been. And government isn't much different than running universities. Becky and I were talking at breakfast. I actually thought that running a cabinet agency was easier than running a university because it was more hierarchical. Because you didn't have shared governance. I mean, no one uses the word shared governance, and I mean, the Congress think they share governance with you, but basically on a day-to-day basis, while they're political agencies, and you have a lot of political appointees in them, they're really very different places. Mrs. Clinton, when she was at Beijing, most people don't know this, I was actually the co-chair of the delegation. She and Madeline sort of flew in for her speech and then left me to negotiate with a lot of very difficult people. But I was there when she said that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And it's been a lot of years since that Beijing conference. It was an extraordinary conference. Is there anyone here that was in Beijing? Ah, back there. Both in the non-governmental organizations that were there that had their own conference and the way in which the whole thing was organized. Her speech really electrified the audience. I had read her speech, and I didn't think it was going to be, I thought it was going to be a good speech by the First Lady, but I hadn't realized how much that phrase was going to electrify the audience. So I was actually sitting in the U.S. chair when she did that, and I almost fell over because I could feel the electricity in the audience. There were delegates from 189 countries, and we negotiated a platform that was very ambitious. And it was all about ensuring full and equal participation of girls and women in every aspect of life. So what has changed since then? In what ways are girls and women better off now than they were 2 decades ago? In what areas do we still have a long way to go? When Mrs. Clinton came out of the State Department, she actually came over to the foundation for less than a year, for a period of time. And she launched a project called No Ceilings, called the Full Participation Project. And she asked the question, and we actually did it with the Gates Foundation and took a lot of money. She asked the question, what has been the improvement since Beijing? Because no one had ever gone out and actually measured what difference the Beijing conference had been. And one of the things I learned in international global work is that while we in the U.S. Sort of take these conferences seriously, the rest of the world takes them very seriously. They actually pay attention to what the standards are they're supposed to meet. And no matter what the country is, or how strange you think the country is or their leadership, they actually take whatever it is and try to measure themselves against it. So what we negotiated, the platform we negotiated, what Mrs. Clinton wanted to know, and she charged the Clinton Foundation with doing, was actually going out and measuring it. And we did it the way an academic would do it. We did data-driven analysis, we did evidence-based public education, and we put together some very innovative partnerships. And in March of last year, in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we released the full participation report, which carefully compiled data to provide a comprehensive look at the status of girls and women around the world, where we've been, where we are now, and where we need to go. We also launched an interactive site, a data site, where you can actually go on it. It's called noceilings.org. You actually can go on it, and we not only tell stories and put out data, but we look at 190 countries and over 850,000 data points in the last 20 years. You can actually look up a country and see what their progress has been. And so today I thought I'd share a few of our findings, and then I'd like to, I don't know whether I'm supposed to go to Q's and A's, but I love going to Q's and A's. So then I'd like to go to Q's and A's and answer questions that you might have. First of all, there have been real gains over the last 2 decades. One of the things in this conference is you've both seen the positives and the negatives of what's going on in the world. And there's no question. You can look at an individual country and an individual issue, and you can find a lot of negative things. But if you look in the areas of health and education in particular and their impact on women and girls, the global rate of maternal mortality, for example, has been nearly cut in half since 1995. And South Asia has made the biggest improvement. They've cut it 60%. They've had a 60% reduction in deaths. I saw the impact in Peru of Peru actually sending women to hospitals to have their babies. And what Peru did is, and I think there are some nursing people here, Peru trained a new generation of nurses with 5 years of training. And they're not the midwives, but they do all the pre-stuff that you need to do for pregnant women. And then women are sent to hospitals or to clinics to have their babies. They move from having babies in their homes to having them in hospitals. And CARE asked me to, my good friend Elaine Gale asked me to go and see the progress that Peru had made. And as I went through the hospital, I asked each of the women where they had been born. And all of them had been born at home. And then I asked them the second question. And the second question was, so why are you here in the hospital? And they said, because they had sisters and brothers who had died at birth. And one of them had had a mother that had died at birth. And as a Peace Corps volunteer, I had seen this in Iran, women that couldn't get to clinics or couldn't get health care and had died in childbirth. And so what was interesting to me was whether we went to the clinics, whether we went to the villages, whether we talked to government officials, everybody had the same talking points. They all knew the reasons why they were getting prenatal care and why they were going to clinics and hospitals to get their health care. And Peru has made they have over 70%. Peru has made a dramatic change. And, you know, frankly, it was just the leaders of Peru, not just the health minister. Someone had explained to them if they did the following, that it could have an impact on women's lives and on children's lives, and they just did it. they did it. But what was impressive was the talking points, that everybody had the same line, whoever you asked, in whatever village you went to. So that was very impressive. So the global rate of maternal mortality, cutting that in half has been a big impact. But if you go to the data sets that we've provided, you'll see different issues in different countries. The gender gap in primary education enrollment has virtually closed around the world. And women now actually outnumber men in tertiary education. But for primary education in particular, we finally are closing the gap. We don't know much about the quality of that education. So I want to be very careful when we talk about primary education. We're putting a lot of girls in school, but as we heard yesterday in the keynote, some of them are going to school hungry. And some of them are dropping out as well, and they're certainly not going to secondary education in any kind of numbers, and I'll talk about those numbers. And we still have challenges every day. Women still die largely from preventable causes during pregnancy and childbirth, and more than 220 million around the world want to prevent pregnancy, but they're not using modern contraception. So family planning is still a huge issue around the world, not helped by the internal debate we've had in the United States for more than 4 decades. And you know, it's very interesting, but it's so uneven around the country. Do you know what country has the best family planning all over the country, family planning clinics all over the country? Iran. Iran. And has had them for decades. Iran made a commitment to family planning a lifetime ago. Literally, while I was living in Iran as a Peace Corps volunteer in the 1960s. They made a commitment. They have high quality family planning in Iran. I mean, you could always say Cuba because they have pretty good primary care, depending on where you live in Cuba. But in Iran, so you have to be careful, and one of the reasons we have to disaggregate the data and look country by country is that you never know. I mean, they don't have tertiary care but for everybody, but they certainly have high quality family planning. And then I wanted to talk a little more about the secondary level gap that we have. Less than 1 in 3 girls in Africa and fewer than half in South Asia are enrolled in secondary school. So that's still the gap in education. And the thing about education is that if you look around the world, women actually outnumber men at the university level, but they're underrepresented in STEM education and in STEM careers. So there are a lot of things that are going on here in terms of the data. And beyond health and education, there are many areas where the progress has been slow or more sporadic. We're still making the case about the labor force. Women's global participation in the labor force has been stagnant for 2 decades, and the gender pay gap persists in almost every country in the planet. Access to water, women are working, but they're working without getting paid. One of my great friends in college was the daughter of a prominent labor official in Kenya. She actually married the great young youth leader of Kenya, Tom Mboya, who was assassinated probably by Kenyatta or one of the political parties at the time. And I went to visit her in Kenya about 10 years ago before she passed away. And she took me out to her village in Kenya where her mother lived. And we're sitting in their house, and we were talking about the women's movement and about freedom for women. Her mother walked in and said, "You know what is freedom for me and for the women of this village?" She said, "That well out there." And I think I will remember that all of my life, because when we talk about liberating women and giving them opportunity, and for my foundation, which works with women entrepreneurs and tries to encourage women, particularly smallholder farmers and women who start businesses all over the world, remembering that they can't be free unless they have reproductive health and they have access to things like wells in their community. And access to education is very important as part of this. The number of leadership positions has increased in government and the private sector. We're still dramatically underrepresented. And legal protections against violence have increased significantly, but whether they're implemented is a whole different issue around the world. And if you looked at the program here for 4W, there was a lot of discussion about that. And violence against women remains a global epidemic, as does trafficking and a lot of other things we've talked about. There's a lot more work to do. Connecting women's economic survival and women's economic progress with the economic progress of nations becomes terribly important. And as we go into another UN session, one of the things that points we have to make over and over again is the progress of countries depends on the progress of women, that there's a direct link. Every economic study has told us that increasing women's education, giving women access to work, and giving them access to economic futures will have a major impact on what they're able to do in the future. And that involves changing male attitudes about all of these things. I began my career in a mud village in southern Iran as a Peace Corps volunteer. No running water, no electricity. I had only one advantage. My grandmother, who was born in Lebanon, grew up in a convent in Lebanon because her mother had died, gave me a letter as I was leaving the house. And my parents had absolutely objected to me going into the Peace Corps. My father offered me a Mustang. Years later, I thought about buying one, but he offered me a Mustang. And then he said he'd buy me a red Mustang. Actually, that Mustang would be worth a lot of money now. But my grandmother said she's going to the old country. So she came from Lebanon. She considered Iran part of the old country. So she said to me, take this letter to the head man of the village. So when I arrived in my village, I went off looking for the head man. The head man turned out to be a mullah. And he was a very nice mullah, and I handed him the letter, and he opened up the letter. I did not read Arabic. I spoke some Arabic, but I didn't read Arabic. It was actually an Arab village in southern Iran, in Khuzestan, which was heavily Arab, because Iran is made up of different tribes, and they have a lot of Arabs that live in, that are Iranian Arabs. So he opens the letter, and he starts laughing. And I said, what does it say? My Persian was better than my Arabic. He said, it says, this is to introduce Donna Shalala, the daughter of a great sheikh in Cleveland, Ohio. Please put her under your protection. He actually did. He actually did. But what he really did was he gave us access to decision-making in that village. And while we were working at an agricultural college, we wanted to do some things in the village, in particular to expand opportunities. There was no school in that village, and we wanted both girls and boys to be able to go to school all those years ago. And I remember going to him and saying, you know, we're willing to help you build a school. In fact, the Peace Corps guys have invented this new kind of mud brick that had straw in it, and it was stronger than what they were building with, and we'd love for the first building to be a school. And he said, nah, he said, that's not our priority, basically. He said, that's not our priority. And he said, I think we need a mosque. And they were doing the call from the minaret by tape, basically, with a battery, with batteries. And I went back to talk to the Peace Corps guys. One of them had graduated from Stanford and gave me this lecture on church state and how we were government employees and we couldn't build mosques. But finally, after about 6 months, we decided the Peace Corps didn't know where we were anyhow. So they want a mosque, we'll build a mosque. So we helped them build a mosque. On the day the mosque was dedicated, we all went over. We were very proud. It was a very nice looking little mosque. And he was just thrilled. And he came up to us and said, you know, we've been thinking. We think it's time to build a school. Now, what's the lesson there? Is the lesson honor thy God? Or is the lesson you listen? The one thing that President Clinton repeats over and over again is that the people we work with are smarter than we are, or just as smart as we are. They're just poor. And one of the things I learned in that mud village was to listen to what people's priorities are. All the jobs I've interviewed for over the years, they wanted to know what my vision was. And all of them, I told that story about the mosque and the mullah, because it's very difficult to figure out a vision if you don't know the place where you are, if you don't understand the institution where you are. They always have that question. I used to yell at the search committees not to ask that question, because the real question is whether the leader was nimble enough to listen, and whether they listened well enough and understood the culture of the institution that they were going into and could put together the vision, which was a consensus. Not that you couldn't nudge, consider myself a world-class nudger, but that you had to learn to listen. And in that mud village, I learned to listen. And when I said to him, are you interested in sending the girls and the boys to school? He said, absolutely. He said, I've seen all these Peace Corps girls, and they're pretty smart. He said, and my wife would kill me if I didn't make sure the girls. There's still a school in that village. It's not as much of a mud village as it was before, but there's still a school in that village. We've got a lot of gaps. Expanding women in the workforce, more schooling. Women have uneven internet access all over the world. 1 in 4 girls still is married before they're 18. In the United States is one of 9 countries that doesn't provide paid maternity leave. 1 in 3 women suffer physical and sexual violence. I mean, the gender gap in the workforce participation hasn't changed really in 20 years. So we've got a lot of work to do. And it requires building consensus, building coalitions, but holding everyone in the world to high standards. And the fact is, we've made progress in 20 years. We've made some progress. There are people that are living longer in 20 years. But we can't take another 20 years. We have to do it much more quickly. And hopefully with pressure on a new generation of political leaders, we're going to have an opportunity to do that. I'm delighted always to come back to Wisconsin. Go Badgers. Okay. I think I've got 15 minutes for questions. Where are my leaders? Okay, if I do questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to sneak here and get the microphones.
Okay, good. So I can get off here and answer questions? We had a number of chancellors here who needed that stool. Yeah. Becky, we should actually put our names on it. You know, we should all sign it. Yeah. For the streaming. Back on my stool. Okay, questions? Yes, over here. Yes.
I'm so glad you wanted Wisconsin to be number 1, not just competitive. I worry about climate change a lot. That's where I focus.
Right.
And in large part as a feminist, because women will be much more adversely impacted as
Right.
systems collapse. What do we do? Is nudging enough?
No. And I just spent a year on a panel led by Bloomberg, Hank Paulson, and Bob Rubin, economists, I mean basically financial leaders, doing a report called Risky Business that basically made the economic argument for climate change, that unless we took very strong steps towards climate change, that's the beginning of a very different kind of coalition that comes out of the insurance companies, and building that coalition is going to be very important. At the Clinton Foundation, we're deeply involved in climate change. We, in fact, are organizing we're trying to fill in a niche. Most recently, we're organizing the islands of the Caribbean who don't have the capacity. 25% of their government spending is on oil and gas, and they don't have the capacity to bid out for wind farms and for other ways to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels. And so we actually, with money from the government of Norway, from their development fund, are organizing not only Caribbean islands, but islands all over the world to help them reduce their dependency. That's one small niche. But we're also partners with most of the major efforts and major NGOs working on climate change. Listen, I come from Miami. You want to talk about climate change? I showed, Bob Rubin was born in, I don't know whether you knew this, Becky, in Miami Beach. So I showed him his high school flooded after the last flood. I sent him a picture of his high school flooded. He said, oh my God. So he takes it around when he talks about climate change with everyone. We've got to take climate change seriously. One of the things about UW-Madison is they've taken climate change seriously for generations. And some of the best environmental people in the world are here at UW-Madison. The state has mostly taken this seriously. We've reduced our dependence on oil. There's no question about it. We've got lots of things going on. Some of us have some ideas. President Clinton has an idea about helping Indian reservations that don't have income from gambling with wind farms, increasing their income with wind farms and with other kinds of economic strategies for them. And that's something he's asked me to pursue over the next year, to start those conversations and to see whether anyone is interested. My guess is, particularly in North Dakota and some of those places where we have very poor Native American tribes, we might try some new economic development strategies in those places.
The United States has an increasing percentage of its women behind bars, and it's costing us money that we could put into climate change. And the schools can help us, help in this. The universities can help by indeed having programs for these women. There are fewer good programs for women behind bars than for men behind bars, helping the women when they get out of prisons to become full citizens again. This is a big issue for all of us because, again, we are, this whole scene is sucking in resources that can be put to other uses, and it's doing us as a nation no good. It's especially hurting women of color. What can we do besides just watching Orange is the New Black or otherwise reflecting on these issues? Thank you very much for being here.
I think there's a lot going on. I can't speak for the Clinton Foundation because we're not working in that area. We are working in the juvenile justice area, and there's a lot of work going on now, and I expect the next administration to take even stronger steps. President Obama has started those. There is a coalition. There is a bipartisan coalition in this area. It's one of the few areas where you can see the bipartisan coalition coming together, both for reducing the number of people that end up with jail terms, the incarceration, as well as the kind of support services people need before they go in and after they go in, and when they come out. So that is one area in which you can see consensus in this country, and I expect over the next year, actually, next year, for us to see some dramatic legislation. Yep, wherever you're.
Go ahead.
No, you've got the microphone.
I wanted to ask a question on your view of Americans working together while honoring diversity. Are we making progress in that area?
Oh, I think we are. In my lifetime, are you kidding me? Yes. But we have to keep working at it. We have to keep working at it. We have to keep working at it. I mean, we just, most of us in the academy believe that you cannot be first rate without diversity, that it actually enhances the quality of scholarship, of all sorts of social interactions, that it builds a nation, and that and that it's absolutely a critical part of both a young person's experience in higher education as well as later. That's part of citizenship. So as long as we keep seeing it as an integral part, not as an add-on, I think we have some opportunity. Yeah. Becky, why don't you get up here with me and answer some of these questions now?
This will have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Azan Nurmandarad, born in Iran at
Ah.
the time that you were
Khoham-
there, except in
Khoshamadid.
Tehran. And thank you so much for sharing your story. And being born as a Muslim, and I came here for all my college education in physics, atomic physics, and nuclear physics, and now I'm retired, professor from here. My question is that knowing what is going on in the Muslim world, what are your plans or visions or anything that being done within the Clinton Foundation as to liberate those women? They are still cutting them. They are still, denying them from educations,
Yeah.
covering their
Yeah.
hair.
There are two ways that we work on women and girls issues. One is to organize smallholder farmers, most of whom are women, and to actually get their products to market. We actually set up for-profit companies and do the supply chain piece. So, and sometimes it's smallholder farmers like the peanut farmers in Haiti or in Africa. We're working with smallholder farmers. And we actually identify in the Caribbean, in Cartagena, for example, we've organized the small farmers that produce produce, both vegetables as well as fruits, and all of the local restaurants and hotels in Cartagena now use locally sourced. They couldn't do it before because there was no supply chain, no way to guarantee quality, and we've actually put together a for-profit company, and then we reinvest the profits in those farmers. Most of those farmers are women. In the Middle East, most of our focus now with the Clinton Global Initiative, which means with corporate partners, is on working with refugees, with the Jordanian government in particular, but most recently I met with the Lebanese education minister. He's got 300,000 kids he doesn't have classrooms for. He doesn't have seats in classrooms for. And the Jordanians and the Turks have done a magnificent job with what they have, but they're really very short. And they want to do more things in the places where people are living in terms of economic empowerment and opportunities for people to work. So we, if you go to Haiti with me, we've done some magnificent things. The artisans in Haiti are magnificent. And one of the things they work on is things like paper mache. We took a small women-owned business and expanded it into a medium-sized business and source their products with West Elm. So they have a huge contract from West Elm. So those stools that you see, all that paper mache stuff in West Elm, those are made in Haiti out of the companies that we've created. That's a women-owned business, and it's changing women's economic opportunities. I think most of us believe that social investment, creating for-profit companies which are sustainable as opposed to charity, which isn't sustainable, and finding ways in which we can empower women. Through the Clinton Global Initiative, which is a very different kind of organization, we don't deliver any services. We put together NGOs with for-profit companies, mostly with corporations. And Tata, which is this huge corporation in India, is testing refurbished phones in which they download for women entrepreneurs, small businesses, financial literacy. The phone is connected directly with the bank, so their husbands won't steal the money. And they're going to educate large numbers. They're starting with 25,000 women the first year, but they're going to educate large numbers of women-owned business women and give them the financial literacy they need to expand their businesses, but more importantly, to connect them with credit and with banking services. So through the Clinton Global Initiative, we do a lot of things, both in the Muslim world. We're not doing the political stuff. I mean, we're a not-for-profit foundation. It grew out of the president going around the world to all these conferences they wanted him to speak at, and no one did anything. So the Clinton Global Initiative, which is the big conference we have, and then we have a smaller one, Clinton CGI America, and then we do one on university campuses. We just did it in Berkeley. You have to make a commitment. You have to do something somewhere in the world to improve people's lives, to be involved with the CGI. But we make the match. If someone needs a match, we make the match. So we're working both in the Muslim world as well as in Latin America. We're just starting some work in Asia, but a lot of it is with where the world is located, with smallholder farmers, with women entrepreneurs, and most of our initiatives are focused very heavily on women. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lori.
I want to thank so much to Dr. Shalala for being here. She is an inspiration. You can't know where you're going until you really know where you've come from. And I think 4W, we had dreams, we had actions, we had plans. But this visit helps us really to look back, remember where we're coming from, helps us see where we're going. You are the quintessential 4W woman. And our students want to be like you. The young men and women we teach want to be like you. And we hope you'll come back next year. But we're not going to hold you to that. But thank you so much. And I really wish you well with all you do tomorrow.